So today we're going to be having a session here on other places you can put solar panels, because we all love them and we just want to see them everywhere. So the first one we're going to talk about is Agrivoltaics, and our first speaker on that is Austin Kinzer, who is a PhD student at the Colorado School of Mines and also works at NREL on Agrivoltaics.
There we go. Okay. My name is Austin Kinzer. Very happy to be here with you all today. Got this guy here, and let's get into it. So let's start with the why. So in order to meet our decarbonization goals, we need to deploy a lot of solar, and that's going to take up a lot of land area. So we are currently, I think, just shy of 100 gigawatts of solar. We need to roughly quadruple that by mid-century. And in terms of the land requirements, if we're factoring in decarbonization, including electrification of buildings and industrial loads, we're looking at a land area for solar alone larger than the state of Maryland. So there's some issues here. One of the key facts here is that land that is great for solar happens to be generally pretty good for agriculture. You need the sun for both, go figure. So in addition to that, farmers are struggling. Agriculture is a low-margin business, and farmers generally don't like to see solar projects in their neighborhood. They don't want to see prime agricultural land turned into solar projects. They see it as this big industrial eyesore. So, we see a way for mutual benefits to exist between the two, and this is what we're working on at NREL, as well as with a wide array of industry partners. So just kind of the 101, agrivoltaics is just performing agriculture under solar panels, harvesting the sun twice, we like to say. So NREL is leading this work right now, trying to see how we can meet our renewable energy goals, reduce water needs for irrigation, and create a more sustainable food system. So generally, there are 4 types of agrivoltaics. So the most common is actually the pollinator habitat. That's what you'll see a lot of. Kind of what a lot of the pictures tend to depict is crop production. But then you also see grazing livestock, typically sheep, or the last is controlled environment agriculture, which is just a way of saying greenhouses. So several different configurations you can see here. So on the top row we have this is basically just standard utility scale ground mount solar with different types of ground cover, whether for grazing or for pollinator habitats. Or you can see on the bottom row we have a variety of different mounts that are intended to let more light underneath to be available for the crops. You can also have a vertical mount with the vertical bifacial panels, which allows farm machinery to pass easily between the rows. Or you can even see the tracker stilt mount, which features dual axis tracking, and so you can really get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of the solar panels covering the land. So the DOE Inspire project is really the main research effort focused on this. Inspire stands, if I can get this acronym right, I'm new to working in government, and there are so many acronyms, you would not believe it. But this one specifically is Innovative Solar Practices Integrating Rural Economies and Ecosystems. So, thank you. I was working on that last night. So generally 2 avenues. We're looking at field research and analytical research. So out in the field, we're looking at what is the economic viability for both solar and agriculture for doing this. How can we improve agricultural yields, especially in arid environments, such as we have in the American Southwest? How does this affect energy, water, and food security, especially for less developed countries and in remote areas? And then how can we benefit the broader ecosystem? In terms of analytical work, we're also looking at cost benefits for potentially reducing operations and maintenance costs. That'll come up a bit. And really valuing the ecological services that we can provide by better utilizing the land underneath solar panels. And then we're also looking at just what are the ground cover practices under solar, because it varies quite a bit depending on the developer, depending on the location. So we've got projects all over the US right now, so from coast to coast, working with universities, working with farmers, working with other research institutions, and working with solar developers too. So we'll look into a few of them, but generally we're doing a few things on our field sites. Number one is vegetation monitoring, so just understanding what is happening to the plants underneath the panels. And we're doing this with detailed instrumentation, so looking at soil temperature, soil moisture, looking at soil carbon content, looking at the humidity, the wind, all these various factors to really understand precisely what is happening in the sort of microclimatic conditions that are created under the solar array. And then we're also looking at beneficial insect populations, so understanding how does deploying or planting all this native vegetation underneath solar arrays affects the local insect populations that we want to see to help agriculture. So again, just a quick overview of all the partners. Not a lot to see on there, but kind of moving through. So looking at crop production, it's generally going to be between the rows or underneath the panels. A lot of what we're seeing right now is still pretty small scale. The largest projects in the US are on the order of a few megawatts. Jack's Solar Garden, Allison will be talking about next, being the largest here in Colorado. And it's typically small-scale agriculture. And we're really just trying to understand how does the crop performance vary depending on the system design, depending on the crop, depending on the specific variety of the crop, and how can we better improve that to get better outcomes. So looking at a variety of factors, including panel height, spacing, O&M needs, water access, and then what does that mean for agricultural revenue. This is a project down in Arizona, University of Arizona, the Biosphere 2 facility. So we have a project, and they're growing mostly tomatoes and peppers at this facility. And so some of the results we're seeing across the energy, water, food nexus, from an energy perspective, we can reduce the panel operating temperature during the daytime on the order of about 10 degrees Celsius, which has a meaningful impact on energy generation, makes the panels more efficient. And so over the course of the year, this results in a generation increase of about 2%, as opposed to what you'd see with just bare ground underneath the panels. From the food perspective, we actually see triple the yield of chiltepin peppers, double the yield for tomatoes, and about the same yield for jalapenos. And we can do that with less water. 50% less water for the peppers, 30% less water for the tomatoes. So this is a site in Massachusetts, and the thing I'd like to highlight here is on the right you can see the broccoli, and you'll see these were all harvested at the same time, but in different locations within the array. So you can see there's a massive difference between the ones on the ends versus in the middle, and that's all a function of where they are relative to the panels, how much light they're getting. So figuring out what'll do well in which position within the array relative to the panels, relative to the other crops, is really at the heart of what we're trying to learn here to make these projects more effective. Looking at the pollinator side, this is a good opportunity to provide native vegetation. And furthermore, in doing that, we can benefit farms in the area. So it's not just a benefit to the solar developer who can reduce their O&M costs, get some good PR, but it's also a benefit to farms in the area that can benefit from higher pollinator abundance. And so various factors we're looking at, again, looking at panel height, but also looking at what seed mixes to use and where. And what does that mean for stormwater management? If we're reducing the amount of runoff, how does that affect permitting needs? If we're permitting solar projects the same way we permit other industrial facilities, why are we not taking into account the fact that we can actually be reducing runoff and soil erosion underneath the array by planting native vegetation? So again, trying to get a handle on what these benefits are. So looking at some sites in Minnesota, This is site-specific, but we can see a pretty massive increase in the beneficial habitat for our pollinators, or 5x increase over a period of 3 years, which results in a 20x increase in the amount of pollinator species, or the population. And then we can, again, improve panel efficiency, result in more generation, and potentially reduce the number of times you need to pay someone to go out there with a mower and burn fossil fuels to mow the grass under the panels. So again, just high-level points. We're trying to put values to these with our modeling work as well and validate it with field work, but we see an increase in pollinator abundance, an increase in the carbon storage potential of the soil, increase in water retention of the soil, and a reduction in soil erosion. And there's a massive amount of agricultural land in the US that would benefit from having native vegetation for pollinators planted underneath it. So this is a massive opportunity. We're just trying to figure out how can we do this at scale. Looking at grazing, we know, depending on your view on livestock, but the grazing can improve soil health. How that affects the net carbon balance of whether you're raising livestock or not, I won't get into. And you can reduce costs. We're trying to understand, how can we integrate this with the pollinator habitats. One of the things here to consider is panel heights. One thing people learn very quickly is that you don't bring goats onto a utility ground mount site because they like to jump on the panels. So if you want to graze goats, you're going to want to raise the panels a bit more. It also brings in some issues with cable management, and if you're going to have people and livestock underneath the array, there are some additional considerations there to make sure it's safe for people and animals. Here you can see by grazing sheep at a solar site, an increase in total carbon and nitrogen stored in the soil, and it increases the more years you do it. Pretty simple and intuitive, but it turns out, grazing livestock is going to improve soil health. Go figure. Now, moving on to greenhouses. So one of the big concerns with greenhouse agriculture is the energy needs. They're very energy intensive, and so by adding solar panels to the design, you can reduce that energy intensity and provide some of that energy need. Probably not all of it, but a good chunk of it. Another factor to consider here is with a new greenhouse with solar roof, you can get the investment tax credit. So that's potentially 30% of the value of the project right there. And some of the work going on here is looking at, for example, tunable wavelength materials. So if you see on the top left there, there's the red tinted panels. And so these have a dye in the glass that converts 80% of the incoming green light, which is reflected by the crops, not used for photosynthesis, and converts it to red light, which is more effective for photosynthesis. So there's some interesting work going on there. Also looking at bifacial panels with the cells spaced out a little bit more, just to allow more light to get through. So again, there's a ton of potential here. It's really just figuring out the contours of what technology does this work with, where, and what configuration with what crops. It's a harder problem to solve than it might seem on its face. So kind of wrap up with kind of where the research is going and how, again, we can really get this to scale to maximize the benefits for people, for the environment, and for companies. So understanding the trade-offs in crop yields, understanding the potential water savings that we can have, understanding the microclimatic conditions. Personally, I've been working on the shading modeling, so understanding the irradiance and how the shadows move throughout the array so that you can choose your design based on the crops and the location, or you can choose how you arrange the crops within the array to maximize the benefits. And then again, looking at this for off-grid areas. So how can we maximize the benefits, and how would this maybe play in conjunction with microgrids? I think that's all fruitful areas for research. Looking more at the ecosystem services perspective, again, looking at the pollinator species and how those populations are affected. So how will that affect agricultural yields on adjacent agricultural land? How can we use existing utility solar sites and add native vegetation and benefit, again, potentially reducing the O&M costs and benefiting nearby farms? What effect does that have on soil and nutrients? And then what does that have on PV output? And then finally, looking at the capital cost impacts of agrivoltaic configurations. One of the big concerns is that you do generally need to elevate the panels higher. So, depending on how high, you might be adding 10, 50 cents a watt, somewhere on that order of magnitude. So that is going to affect the capital cost. So, we want to be able to make sure that if we're doing that, we can prove that the rest of the value that the system can provide. And then looking at how this affects operations and maintenance. It does get a little more complicated. If you elevate the panels, it's harder for a technician to work on them. So that's one of the trade-offs to consider. And then, really figuring out just how can we adapt solar to farming and how can we adapt farming to solar in terms of new machinery and new methods to make this work effectively and provide the mutual benefits that we know are there, that we just need to figure out how to capture. So I'd like to thank you all for your time. If you want to learn more about agrivoltaics, check out the Inspire website there. And I'm happy to pass it off to the next.
Our next speaker is Allison Jackson with Jack's Solar Garden, and she is an environmental consultant and educator and runs the Agrivoltaic Learning Center. And this is local, so it's great to hear how we're doing this in Colorado.
Thank you. All right, so I'm here on behalf of Jack Solar Garden and the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. That is the nonprofit arm that reaches out to community members and also to students. So which way am I going? There we go. So Adam, we didn't coordinate beforehand, so you might see some of the same graphics. We need more graphic designers in the agrivoltaic space. So as he explained, it's the combination or co-location of agriculture and photovoltaics. So you're sharing the sun between the vegetables underneath with that solar panel. We are seeing that the plants underneath get benefits, right? They have less thermal stress, less water stress, as well as helps to keep the panels cool as well. And he talked about the benefits to the panels, right? Cooler panels are more efficient, and also they are longer lived, so you're not going to have to replace them as fast as if they're in that hotter environment. Like I said, here's the same thing. So general benefits, like we said, water conservation. You can get higher crop yields, as we've seen in those peppers and also tomatoes. Increased solar panel efficiency. You're getting better habitat for wildlife nearby. So you're going to see an increase in the number of pollinators and other native species. Increase in quality of your soils. So as Adam talked about, that increase in carbon and nitrogen that's in your soil. And this also provides crop protection. So in high wind situations or when you have hail damage, these plants underneath the panels won't be as damaged as the ones that are in an open air environment. So it's another benefit. And like he also mentioned, it's a great economic opportunity for farmers that are working on really small margins. We'll skip that one. So here are lots of areas that are focused on agrivoltaics. So agrivoltaics started, the phrase agrivoltaics was coined in the 1980s in Germany, but they didn't have any funding to actually start building these facilities until the 2010s. So that's where it started. It spread a lot throughout Europe. They do a lot of agroforestry, so they have a lot of pear trees, berry bushes that they're doing in combination with the solar panels. We're also seeing a lot of vineyards take this on in areas like Italy and France. It's expanded to the largest agrivoltaic site is actually in China. Theirs is a 1 gigawatt facility, so it's about 1,000 times larger than our facility in Colorado, and they grow goji berries underneath of there. So here is our site. So we are in Longmont, which is in Boulder County. And so this was what it looked like before. It's a 24-acre farm that was primarily used for haying. So you just grow things like smooth brome and alfalfa, and then you cut it and bale it, and then you sell it to people to feed to their cows and horses. As our executive director likes to say, haying sucks. It doesn't bring in a lot of income, and he could barely pay off property taxes, water rights, equipment failures, things like that, before all of the income from the hay was gone. So he needed to figure out a better economic opportunity for his family's farm. So we went from a hayfield that's about 7 acres into a 1.2 megawatt solar array. So that's 1.2 megawatts DC, gets converted to AC, and it's about 960 kilowatt hours per year. So these are monofacial, and single axis tracking. We have 3,276 panels, and so in the morning, they will face towards the east, and they will track the sun throughout the day, but only in one direction. So they're not dual axis, just single axis. Monofacial, so they're only absorbing light on one side, and underneath of it, we're doing a lot of different things. Okay, so another view of it. So these are some, we worked with Namaste Solar, is who actually developed the site, and so they took some really cool drone footage that we like to use, so thank you. I don't know if this video will play, but it shows you the tracking. There we go. So they're flat at nighttime, because that's the safest position for them, and then in the morning, you'll see some of our workers moving very quickly, but so morning, facing towards the east. You can see the dynamic shade and sun that goes on throughout our system, right? So in the morning, that western bed is getting that morning sun and then afternoon shade. The middle bed is about 80% sun, so almost full sun, and that eastern bed gets that really intense afternoon sun and the shade in the morning. So just nice to see how it changes throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, they go back to that flat position. Jack's Solar Garden is a community solar garden. So that is the commercial part of the farm, is to sell the power. And so community solar gardens, this is for people that can't install solar on their own homes. And so they can purchase into our power that we create, and they will get a bill credit, basically. We work with Excel Energy, so anybody on Excel technically could purchase into our community solar garden. We also donate about 2% of our power to low-income families, so they can get a renewable energy for free. So some of our largest subscribers are over here. The city and county of Boulder purchase about 15% of our power. And then we have several commercial subscribers. So we have In the Flow and Terrapin Care Station. Those are both cannabis farmers in Boulder County. And so Boulder County actually taxes cannabis farmers 2 cents per kilowatt hour extra, because they are very high energy users. And so in order to avoid that tax, you could subscribe to a community solar garden. So some of these growers have seen the wisdom of this and are our biggest subscribers. A small grow farm can take, if they had to pay the extra 2 cents per kilowatt hour, could be about $20,000 that they're paying in taxes. It's a really large facility, it might be up to $100,000. So if we had more community solar gardens, other people might see the value of subscribing to them. Other ones, we have Western Disposal, a Premier Credit Union, and then Meaty, which is a mushroom mycelium meat product, so a vegan meat product. Those are all of our biggest subscribers. We also have some residential subscribers that bought in for 5, 10, or 20-year terms. So those are all of our subscribers. So then we just want to talk about how we innovatively use this space, right? It's not just a power plant, it's also a lot of other things. And so here you can see a lot of the different activities that we do underneath of our panels. We'll go through them one by one. So we have research partnerships with NREL, as Adam talked about. We're also working with Colorado State University and University of Arizona. The The Colorado State projects are focused either on pasture, so how can we improve the grass that grows underneath of these panels to feed to animals, forage. We also have a project focused on ecosystem services under the panel, so we're measuring how much carbon is taken out of the air and put into the soil. We're also looking at the flower density, so what areas are providing more food and habitat for pollinators underneath of our panels. So those are the Colorado State. University of Arizona is focused on agricultural crops. So it's the same professor that demonstrated those benefits in Tucson is working with us at JAX, and he's expanded from 3 crops up to 20 different crops that he's looking at underneath these panels. So right now we have harvested all of the leafy greens for the project, and we've moved on to planting in beets and other root vegetables. We also have 2 types of basil, 2 types of peppers, 4 types of tomatoes, and a lot of different potatoes that we're looking at. So in the next few years, we should be able to demonstrate where these crops do best under those, between those 3 different rows, and also be able to demonstrate if we can reduce the amount of irrigation that these plants receive, as well as if there's an increase in yield, increase in health of the plants based on if they're under the panels or not. The NREL projects, as he mentioned, are based mostly on pollinator habitat and also native grasses as well. A little more pictures. We also have a partnership with a nonprofit called Sprout City Farms, and so they focus on farmer training, food access, and also youth education. So they are the ones that are cultivating the crops underneath of our panels. Last year, they cultivated about 3 acres of the land under the panels, and they were able to grow over 8,500 pounds of food. We were just kind of throwing stuff under the panels and seeing how much they could grow, and they were very pleasantly surprised by how much was actually able to grow. All of it was donated to a food bank in Longmont. By the end of the year, the food bank said, we don't need any more carrots. Like, we were harvesting like 500 pounds of carrots in a day. So we kind of ran into a little bit of a distribution problem because we didn't even know where we could send the food because we weren't expecting quite as much of a harvest in our very first year. We weren't able to plant until July 1st. So that's even like half a season. So this year, we're still working out the kinks in the distribution. They've stepped back a tiny bit in terms of how much they're cultivating. So they're cultivating a little over an acre this year, and then the other 2 acres, they're focused on soil health, so we are cover cropping that this year. That will help bring nutrients back into the soil, keep it from being compacted, so that we can use that next year, hopefully expand how much we're cultivating. What they found is that the leafy greens love it under these panels. So if you're getting leafy greens right now, they're not coming anywhere local, right? It's way too hot for these leafy greens to grow. They found that underneath the panels, they can extend their season longer into the summer by having that shade over the top. If it's not shaded, you notice that it'll start to bolt or it'll start to get really bitter and go to seed. And so we actually did a taste test a couple weeks ago. We had some visitors from Department of Energy, and we tasted some lettuce that was underneath the panels versus the control plot that's full sun. And you could literally taste the difference in these 2 different lettuces. The one from the control plot was very bitter, something you would not like to eat, and the one underneath of it was super sweet, still super crisp, and so you can see the benefits in taste and also in yield. They were much larger underneath of the panels than outside of the array. So just some anecdotal things that we've noticed at our crops. Yeah, so this was last year when they cultivated all sorts of different things. Like I said, they're focused mostly on leafy greens this year. Let's see if this works. So here we're looking at the tomatoes. So we planted the tomatoes in that middle row, figuring that they would like that full sun situation. And by putting it in the middle row, we could trellis them up higher, and they wouldn't interfere with the tilting of our panels. So those were about 6 feet tall in the middle row. You can also see some artichokes in the front row, or eggplant, in the front row here, and then some other, I think they had some flowers in the back as well. And again, you can see that dynamic nature of when the shade changes and when these plants are getting shade and sun, and how much less stress that gives those plants by having that little amount of shade. Okay, so our next partnership is with Audubon Rockies, and so they built their largest Habitat Hero garden on the outside of our solar array. And so they planted over 3,000 perennials and native plants that provide food and habitat for birds specifically, but also a lot of other wildlife as well. We see bull snakes out there, we see a lot of different pollinators. We have a ton of berries that are coming in right now, and you can see all of the birds are really enjoying getting that food from our Habitat Hero areas. And then another partnership, so we really like to bring the community out to Jack Solar Garden. And so another way to bring community members out is by supporting local artists. Each year we provide a stipend of $1,000 to a local artist, and they basically get free reign to the site and make whatever kind of art they want. So the first year we had a mixed media artist, so she took some old barn doors basically and turned that into the frame for her photography. She also worked with school students to make the signs that are all around our Habitat Hero area that label the different plants that are out there. Last year we had a dancer as our artist. A lot of the dance studios were closed because of COVID, and so this gave her an open-air dance studio where she was able to teach some dance classes and do some cool video in our solar array. And then this year is our artist is a photographer, and this bottom right one is one of his examples. So this aerial artist hung herself from the torque tube under our panels, and you can see he's done really cool things like putting models around different areas of our solar array. His name's Jeff Goldberg. And then this gets into the work of the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. So we do field trips and other educational experiences with students. So we bring a lot of people out to the farm. Many people have never been inside of a solar array, so getting them that exposure with renewable energy, but also exposing them to innovative agriculture and trying to bring more people into those fields. And so we do field trips. We also try to bring in community members, and so every Saturday at 10 a.m. we have a tour. If any of you are interested, you just go to our website at Jack Solar Garden, and you can sign up for the Saturday tour. It takes about a little over an hour, and you get to see the solar array and all the different partnerships that we have underneath of our panels. And then the last part of the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center is reaching out to policy members. So my job is to develop the curriculum that works with 9th through 12th grade students, and our executive director says that's also a really good resource to use with policymakers. He said that, not me. So same level of what we are looking for here. So we've seen a lot of policymakers on the local level come. One of our biggest supporters as we were trying to get this off the ground was the city and county of Boulder. But we're starting to see more interest on the state level and also the federal level. So this bottom picture, Jared Polis, the governor, came out to the farm and signed a bill on soil health that also gave a little bit of money towards agrivoltaic research in Colorado. Like I said, we just had people from the Department of Energy coming out to see what we're doing and how this can be expanded to other sites. And finally, there are some grants now for similar projects to Jack Solar Garden. So those are our three pillars, is we want to reach out to community members, we want to reach out to students, and also policymakers. And I think that's all I have. Yep, great.
Great, thanks for that great presentation. So now we are going from the land to the water to talk about photovoltaics. So our speaker here is Sika Gadzanku, who is a technology and policy researcher in NREL's Integrated Applications Center.
Is this working? Okay. Great. Well, hi, everyone. I will be presenting on some of our floating solar research at NREL. I'll provide an overview of the technology. I think for some people, they've heard a lot about it. For some, it might be the first time you're hearing about it. And I'll provide an overview of some of the research we've been doing at NREL, and then walk through a Colorado-specific project we worked on. and then end with some of our ongoing and future work. So a lot of the floating solar deployment that has happened has really happened outside of America. So in countries with a lot of expensive land, or just not a lot of land available, they started exploring alternatives to land-based PV systems. And so FPV is really similar to ground mount PV, but the difference is sited on water bodies, and historically it's been sited on artificial water bodies because of concerns around potential environmental impacts of FPV. And the way the system works, if we look at the figure to your right, is that you have the panels kind of sited on a floating structure, and then you have anchors and mooring cables connected to the bottom of the water body, anchored to the shore, or just floating anchors in general. And then it is connected to the main electrical equipment. And there's mainly two configurations, kind of standalone FPV and then hybridized FPV. So with the hybridized FPV, it's usually paired with hydropower, but now we're seeing folks kind of exploring whether FPV could be paired with wind and hydro. So in terms of deployment numbers, still very tiny compared to ground mount PV, but what's exciting about FPV is that different studies have estimated the potential to be anywhere from 400 to 1,000 gigawatts. But if then we're thinking even more expansively, kind of thinking about the hybridization potential with hydropower, that can go up to 4,400 to 5,700 gigawatts. And so this is largely in areas with a lot of existing hydro resources. So in the US, but also just thinking Africa, Latin America, and then Southeast Asia. And then thinking more specifically to the US, projects so far have been really on the smaller scale. So this is just kind of highlighting 3 projects in the US, ranging from kind of 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. And the examples here, 2 of them in California and the others in New Jersey. And then the figure is kind of just showing how deployment has been growing in the last decade or so. I think right now we're about 3 gigawatts of total installed capacity. And most of this has happened in Asia, largely in China, and then Korea, Japan, and now increasingly in Southeast Asia. So in terms of the cost comparison, I like to stress this is a really, really new field. But we did some initial analysis last year looking at how it compares to ground mount PV. And our estimates suggest it's about 25% more expensive. Even though you're saving on land costs, the cost of the floating structures are still really expensive. But we expect that cost will continue to come down as more of it is deployed. So now I'll transition into kind of just walking through some of our projects at NREL. So we like to bucket our FPV research into 4 different areas. So the first is analysis. So a lot of the initial work we did around FPV was really driven by kind of requests from partners in Southeast Asia. So they came to us at NREL because a lot of our work in the region is funded by USAID, and they came to us saying that they're really interested in FPV, but didn't really know a lot about the technology. So the first thing we like to do is get a sense of how much, essentially do kind of a technical potential assessment of the resource. And then also, we're constantly thinking about, can we develop tools to support decision makers? So a lot of the people who came to us, yes, they were departments of energy, but they were also developers in the region. And then the second bucket is kind of in implementation. And so here we start to think about the regulatory landscape. So FPV, again, is really new. And a lot of the deployment was, in different countries, has been funded by various government policies, really trying to focus on building out the local market. So just mapping out that space. So we did a policy kind of analysis, again, focused on Southeast Asia. And then the third bucket is on the monitoring and evaluation. So this has been a bit tricky for NREL because there is an FPV project in Colorado, but we don't have a reservoir on site at NREL. And even though there are a lot of existing projects around the world, like I said, the US market is still really, really new. So that's an area we're trying to grow because, as I'll kind of stress throughout the presentation, there's still a lot unknown about the potential environmental impacts. So whenever I present this slide deck, I like to stress that we know there's a lot that needs to be understood about the environmental impacts of this technology. And then the final bucket is technology research. So a lot of the developers are, again, not specific to the US, or they came from Asia and Europe, and so we're really interested in actually doing more on the R&D side moving forward. So just walking through some of the work we've done, we recently published a report that was thinking about the power system benefits potentially of FPV paired with hydro. And so what we looked at was looking at 3 example systems, kind of a hydropower only system, one that was a standalone FPV system, which had a mix of kind of fossil generation, hydro, and then FPV, but the FPV and hydropower, their operation weren't kind of hybridized. And then the final full hybrid system was looking at what happens if you could pair their operation or coordinate how they're operated. And high level, some of our findings suggest, and it's quite similar to kind of what you see with just even thinking about ground mount PV paired with hydro, but because of the complementarity of hydro and PV, we see that by pairing FPV with hydro, you can lower the PV curtailment. And this kind of is assuming that you would want to install FPV on an existing reservoir. So what we've seen in different countries is that when they're siting the PV, they want to save cost by connecting to an existing transmission network. So transmission can become a constraint where you can't build new transmission. So assuming that was the issue, we saw that by hybridizing FPV with hydro, you could reduce PV curtailment because you're able to coordinate operation between the hydro system and PV. But also it reduced dependence on other types of generation. So for this very small system we modeled, the gas-fired generation was being used quite a bit. And so by having that hybridized option, you're just able to reduce reliance on that. And then the final one is around conserving water by shifting when the hydro is used in the year. So in countries that are very hydro dependent and also have a lot of concerns around kind of droughts, there's just been a lot of interest in this specifically because, for example, I won't mention the country that this was modeled after, but there is a country in Southeast Asia that is very dependent on hydropower, and they have a lot of power outages during the dry season. So there's interest in if we could build or site FPV on existing hydropower resources and link them, then during the dry season, we can save that water. During the wet season, we can save that water, some of that water for use during later of the year, use more of your PV, and then just make the system more reliable and reduce power outages. And then shifting gears to the more kind of US-specific work, we've done work at kind of the national level, kind of Colorado-focused work, and then some work with the Bureau of Reclamation. So here, they've been getting a lot of requests to develop FPV. So they just wanted to kind of do a holistic analysis of, I guess, the different aspects of deploying FPV. So we did kind of a pre-feasibility study for 4 sites where we looked at the economics, the technology itself, the potential evaporation savings opportunity, the policy space, and then kind of the environmental and recreational space. Because the thing with a lot of existing reservoirs is that they're multi-purpose, and that can be a reason why FPV would not be deployed on a reservoir. Now shifting to Colorado-specific work, here we did a technical potential study. We, in collaboration with the Colorado Energy Office and CLA-TER, they are one of the leading developers, and we kind of tried to identify suitable sites for FPV, and I'll walk through in subsequent slides kind of exactly how we did that. So the first thing when we're doing a technical potential, say someone comes to us and they say, for example, South Africa is interested in floating solar, we like to just first see, are there any sites that could feasibly host an FPV system? So for the Colorado effort, we used the National Hydrography Dataset, and we, at the very high level, identified some water bodies. And then the second thing, which the really cool thing we were able to do with this study that we've not been able to do with global studies is actually, visit some of the sites and then really do a robust analysis of the data set to remove any duplication, but also sites we may have missed from the national data set. And so we ended up with about 6,000 water bodies in Colorado that para-analysis could feasibly host FPV. Now, those are just water bodies, but with our technical potential, we also add some exclusions. So in this case, kind of accounting for which ones have direct access to roads, which ones have good reservoir shapes. So that's really important when you're thinking about how the shape of the reservoirs changes over seasons. So if it really dries out, you really want to take that into account if you're thinking about whether it can host FPV. And then we also excluded the recreational reservoirs. So we know Colorado, people really love water sports is a huge activity here. So again, thinking about potential constraints or issues the community may have with hosting an FPV system on a reservoir. And then the final one was around kind of shading impacts, just trying to exclude sites that have so much shading that could impact the PV generation. So this is just a visual of kind of the final set of water bodies we ended up with in Colorado. The final number was about 2,000. And then the second step is actually calculating the FPV potential. So for each site, we use one of NREL's models to estimate the potential electricity generation at each site, and then we just aggregate it for all of the water bodies in the data set, and then do a geospatial visualization. So this shows that technical potential in megawatts. The larger the circle, the more the technical potential, and the deeper the shade, the higher the quality of the solar resource there. And then this is just annual generation. And then this slide is kind of just showing how, depending on the exclusions you consider in this very site-specific analysis, that can change how much PV you could actually put on a reservoir. So on the left, this was a site in Colorado, but we assumed we could put, let's say, 4 PV systems on that site. But once we accounted for even just kind of the way the shape would change over time, the potential PV capacity for that site reduced from 35 megawatts to 12 megawatts. And so the more and more of the work we're doing right now, especially when it's more state or city focused, is really trying to collect as much site-specific data so that the decision makers don't overestimate the PV potential at a water body. And then in terms of environmental consideration, so we are not kind of conducting any of this work specifically, but for the Colorado study, what we were able to do was essentially map out the different kinds of data you would need to collect to start to understand the potential kind of environmental impacts at a certain site. So kind of thinking about evaporation, changes in evaporation, algae growth, wildlife, water quality, and then land use benefits. And I will just wrap up with some of our ongoing and future work. So we've been very excited to get funding from Solar Energy Technologies Office. So we did kind of the first national floating solar technical potential a couple years ago, but now we're actually we have more funding to do a more refined study, but also actually develop tools for decision makers. So we'll have a tool that a potential developer can use to visualize a reservoir and then start the process of actually doing the feasibility study and so on. And then importantly, we'll also be looking at the regulatory aspect of everything. Someone said, trying to deploy FPV or probably any renewable energy technology in the US really is, 50 different states have 50 different laws. So it's a very complicated landscape, and especially for FPV, many agencies haven't really even heard of the technology. So it's really doing all of that initial education, and then hopefully some of those barriers are reduced. And then the final thing here is, I've mentioned Asia a few times in this presentation, but we're doing kind of a regional study for Southeast Asia. A lot of countries in the region are deploying very, very large FPV systems. Thailand, for example, has a very, very ambitious FPV target, and they are very interested in exploring the environmental impacts, but they're also moving ahead, in a way they can't wait. They've said they can't really wait because the research is coming, but it's also taken its time. And so in as much as we can support decision makers as they're moving really quickly and deploying these systems, we want to do that. So just overall takeaways, people are really excited about FPV, but a lot of potential developers still have questions about the technology, benefits, impacts. We see our job as NREL to just contribute knowledge to this growing space. And in as much as it is an opportunity here in the US, just provide tools for decision makers to explore that. And then again, we'll end the presentation stressing more research is needed into the potential environmental and ecological impacts of FPV system. This is our research team. And I don't know if these slides I shared after, but links for further reading. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, let's jump right into audience questions, and if there aren't any, which of course everyone here has one, so great. Do we have?
Or not?
It is.
Thank you. Excellent presentations. The Colorado River system, right, is basically at apocalypse right now. There's some really cool things with agra and floating PV that are still kind of, gosh, we're kind of looking at this. Are there any system, I don't know, anything looking at deploying this at scale, like sooner than later, since we are kind of at apocalypse, Mad Max sorts of levels there? Because obviously I think there's, we could have multiple wins to help our farmers, because I heard that 80% of the water, I think, out of the system is agriculture. So anyway, any thoughts on that?
I think that we would love to scale it up. I think that we, especially for farmers to implement it, we have to demonstrate the benefits concretely before I think it can be scaled up as much. I would love for it to scale faster, but I think until we get more of the proven benefits and more research and data out there, I think that it might be hard for farmers specifically to invest a huge amount of money into it without, I believe in the benefits, but without concrete data, is my thoughts.
Yeah, and to add to that, Agrivoltaics is not going to save the Colorado River on its own. There's a lot of work to be done there. Frankly, one of the challenges we have in scaling this on any reasonable timeline is that farmers tend to be very risk averse, and skeptical of anybody coming in saying this technology is going to change your life. And so there's a lot of social barriers to that as well. So that's part of the challenge that what we're working on is it's not just the research, but also how do we communicate that. The problems with the Colorado River drying up are probably more urgent than what we can address with agrivoltaics alone, but it can be a part of the solution.
And I guess just quickly adding to that on the FPV aspect, again, with the environmental impacts issue, once you scale up, then if there are negative impacts, you're probably scaling those up as well. We've had a lot of conversations with different folks in the US interested in large systems because of concerns around or trying to, if there's like a water savings opportunity there. But again, we just need to do more research, and in as much as our research provides helpful insights that can support that, that would be great.
Got a microphone. Hey, regarding agrivoltaics and Jack Solar Farm, assuming the hay farm hasn't gone out of business since the implementation of the solar, could you A, speak to any financial benefits of the project, and B, any regulatory hurdles that you had to overcome with Boulder County in particular, as we have a PV project on an abandoned coal mine in Boulder County, and we've received extremely intense pushback from the county, and that's been really hard to overcome.
One of the fields is turned into the agrivoltaics. There are still 2 fields that are currently in haying. But yeah, the financial prospects of the farm have increased a lot, right? Selling the power is a much more valuable commodity than selling hay. So yeah, you obviously have to make a large investment, and so you have to think long-term, so you need to work with a landowner that's willing to wait for that income to really be fulfilled and for a few years, right? You have to pay off your system before you can really get into the black. So it's more of like a 20-year investment. So you want somebody that is a landowner that can see the value of staying in the game and seeing how long it's going to take. On the Boulder County, it took him a year to work with the planning committee to change the land use codes. They want to be net zero in terms of energy production by, I think, 2050 is their goal. And so he had to convince them that this aligned with their goals. They also want to preserve the agricultural or pastoral aesthetic of the county. And so they're like, that's agriculture land, you have to farm it. And so he spent a year working with them and trying to convince them that this was something valuable. So there is a new update to the land use codes. It's not only just for Jack Solar Garden. There are probably about 50 other farms in Boulder County that are similarly situated close to the grid that could also implement agrivoltaics. I think it's not, same with farmers. Policymakers can also be very risk adverse. And so working with them and showing the proven benefits and showing that you are working in good faith to create renewable energy that it aligns with their goals, and just being persistent and keeping at it, I commend you. I mean, if the land, I know that I just been doing some research that if it's been degraded, then it should be more available for PV, is my understanding. But you can reach out to Byron for sure.
Hi, thank you so much for the really interesting panel. I'm actually wondering if I could ask more about floating solar voltaics. Specifically, could you go into more of what the laws were in other countries to force them to build photovoltaics on water? And then a follow-up to that, would island communities be able to use this in like a saltwater system on the coast, or to supplement tidal power, or would that degrade the system because of the salt content, and would the waves be too destructive?
To your first question, I guess I'll just walk through different examples. In China, which has really large FPV systems, with a combination of kind of national and regional policies, which really pushed people to develop more renewables, and then encouraged development on abandoned water bodies next to former coal mines. So that drove a lot of deployment in Japan and Korea. They also had a mix of really ambitious renewable energy targets, and so they had a lot of subsidies essentially to really grow the industry, and they were very interested and committed to having a local manufacturing industry. And I believe in one of the two, there was also growing pushback from the community on how renewable energy projects were being supported. So even with the subsidies, eventually they also kind of phased those out. And I mean, now FPV is almost cost comparative to ground mount in those countries. So it's more market-based there. But it's largely been subsidies in the very beginning. India as well, similarly, there were some subsidies or reduced regulatory barriers to encourage deployment. And in terms of island nations, the offshore FPV market is still relatively new, but there has been some deployment in like Seychelles, and some Caribbean nations are interested in it. So there's been deployment there, but there again, we don't have research that is exploring the impacts on those PV systems, and those FPV systems are still relatively new, but countries are still more or less kind of moving forward. And so again, our challenge is, in as much as that's happening, how can we, as the research community, be doing some analysis to support those existing projects, but also inform future ones.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Just a follow-up question to Amanda's question real quick. Has there been any research by NREL or others looking at floating photovoltaics mixed with existing water infrastructure like canals or even specifically like pumped hydro storage, those kind of reservoirs?
Research, I believe, in California that was released about a while back, but it was really just a high-level estimation of the opportunity there. But I haven't seen anything about any actual commercial projects. And that one, again, was looking at the potential evaporation savings if you deployed FPV. But even kind of architecture of the FPV system was really different from what we've seen so far. And in the US, because the systems are still quite small and the canals they were talking about were huge, huge canals, so I would say it was more a conversation starter than anything else. And I think I missed something about the salt water. So just adding to that, like I said, most of the existing systems have been on artificial water bodies. So once you get into salt water, haven't really seen as much research there on potential impacts. Could you repeat the second part of your question?
So with that as well,
funded by DOE right now, we will have a pilot project that is looking at FPV potential on a pumped hydro project in the US. So I guess in 2 years we'll know more definitively, but also actually partners in Thailand, they've announced an FPV pumped hydro system, and we had calls with them, I think a few months ago, where again, they're gonna move forward and they would like to work collaboratively on research to explore the impacts. But that becomes really tricky because of the reservoirs and the change in the levels. And then, you know, if you need different kinds of mooring and anchoring systems, that makes the system more expensive and makes it harder to justify.
One more question?
Yeah, water rights, like as you know, they're very complicated, both for floating and for agro. I'd be curious about like water rights, especially in the Western U.S., both Jack's, your own personal experience, shifting from hay, alfalfa to the crop, and then also being able to change within, because especially as Austin mentioned, the consumption use is different. Once you put the panels over it, you save in the amount that evapotranspirates, which is your water right. So there's a risk of losing it, or there's an opportunity of potentially selling it, although there's not a lot of precedent in that area. So how hard were the water rights in implementing the crop changes, and barriers or potential risks and opportunities in the future?
I can talk specifically about Jack. So they do have water rights. They used it for flood irrigation on the hay fields, and the ones that they're haying, they're still using the flood irrigation. We switched over to drip lines for all of the crop production underneath the panels. So obviously that is more efficient in terms of how much water is evaporated or lost. However, we're building a retention pond to be able to hold on to some water. The pond is still like curing and running into some issues with that. And so we are using basically fire hydrant this year for our drip irrigation. So it's a major concern for us. So as hopefully next year when our irrigation system is better and we also have the retention pond, we should be able to wean ourselves off of that city water. Luckily, we have research partners that can help us out with the cost of that at this point. But I think in the long term that yes, we could be reducing the amount that we're using, both in the savings with the drip irrigation and also the panels overhead, and reducing the evaporative loss from the soil.
So there weren't any complications, because like when you switch from flood to drip, there's a consumptive difference also, and that's actually part of your water right. And there's also a delivery timing as well. Maybe because you're small and the pilot's small and you use municipal stuff, it's there, but like...
Right, so I think that they would take like right now we're just using municipal, but we would take the water rights when we get it and put it into the retention pond, and then that would be the source that we would use. Right now we are still flood irrigating the hay part, so it's still being used, so we're not worried about losing the water rights, as you said, but yeah, there will be some shifting, hopefully, in the next year or two.